This show is produced by the Hartman Media Company. For more information and links to all our great podcasts, visit hartmanmedia.com.
Welcome to the American Monetary Association's podcast, where we explore how monetary policy impacts the real lives of real people and the action steps necessary to preserve wealth and enhance one's lifestyle.
It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Garett Jones to the show. He is a BB&T professor for the study of capitalism at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He's author of 2 books, including Hive Mind, How the Nation's IQ Matters So Much More Than Your Own. I think we'd all agree with that sometimes. Good title. And then his newest book, 10% Less Democracy, Why You Should Trust the Elites, and how a little more and a little less of the masses, and the masses a little less. Sorry, I messed that up a little bit. But Garett, welcome. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure. So the 10% less democracy concept, it feels like that would really rile a lot of people, would be upset by that idea. It seems like we live in a culture now where people think the elites are just screwing us all over. Do you sense that?
Yes. So it turns out that democracy is an absolutely sacred value. The problem is people don't quite know what they mean when they get excited about democracy. To a lot of people, democracy just means voting on things a lot. To other people, democracy means things like having an independent judiciary, having judges who can protect your human rights. And judges are kept about as far away from voters as you can keep them. So,
some judges are appointed, some are elected. So
yes. And I discussed that in the book. So across the U.S. states, it turns out there are a lot of states where people elect their judges and some where they appoint them. And when you try to compare them side by side, it looks like the elected judges are a little bit lazier on the job. The appointed judges tend to write cases. They tend to write judgments that are cited more by other judges. They get recycled.
So the metric there is getting citations. That's the sort of the metric for a good judge, if you will.
That's in that measure. That's the measure that's used. In another cross-country study, turns out that countries that have independent judges just seem to have faster economic growth. Even if you know quite a few other things about the country, like whether it had common law, how rich it started off, whether it's a democracy. Turns out even if you know quite a bit about a country, countries that have independent judges who are kept at least arm's length from the voters, seem to have better economic performance.
Interesting. It would be fair to say, though, appointed judges are only appointed by people who are elected. So it's like one step further removed.
Exactly. That's true.
It's still democratic, though.
This is the question, right? Like what do we mean when we talk about democracy? And I tend to think that I define democracy in a very fairly classic way, which is where the voters are kept in close contact with the government, with, say, frequent elections. That's the way, like, political philosophers, democratic theorists have thought about democracy. So the House of Representatives, for instance, is the U.S.'s obviously most democratic branch of government. 2-year terms. The founders chose that because they wanted the voters to be in close touch with the government. Senate was 6-year terms, where I was a staffer long ago. That's always been considered less democratic. And as a former Senate staffer, I can say that I saw that senators on average behaved in a more politically cowardly way right before an election. The last 2 years, when they're up for re-election, they really are paying attention to what's going on back home.
Right, but isn't that what you call cowardice good? It means they're responding to their constituency. Isn't that what we want, or no?
It turns out there's a very nice study that looks at one particular topic, voting on free trade agreements. Turns out senators are much more likely to vote for free trade agreements when they're far away from re-election. And they're 10 percentage points less likely to vote for it right before re-election. So it turns out Hillary Clinton herself completely embodied this. She voted for every free trade deal her first 4 years as a senator, and she voted against every free trade deal her last 2 years as a senator when she was coming up for re-election.
There's a lot of dynamics to play in that, not just the election, right? Maybe she realizes she made a mistake before and she's changed her view, or maybe the lobbying dynamic changed. I don't know, right? There's a lot to that, maybe.
That's why I don't draw on just individual anecdotes. Instead, I look at studies of dozens of senators voting across dozens of years.
Mm-hmm.
And so it would be kind of weird if it were just a weird coincidence every time that on average senators do this. It turns out it's true even when you compare the senator to him or herself. Just for the same senator, this pattern seems to be repeated every 6 years.
Interesting. Is this kind of somewhat in touch with the idea of the tragedy of the commons or the tyranny of the masses, if you will? Does it have any relation to either of those concepts? It seems like we all would like the idea of more democracy, but democracy is notoriously inefficient too. So you're leaning more toward the representative republic idea than purely democratic idea, right?
I guess I am. That's actually a good way to put it. That the American founders were definitely opposed to anything like pure democracy, like in ancient Athens, where thousands of people would show up to work on legislation. And they always wanted at least representation and maybe even a little bit more distance between the voters and the masses.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, between the voters and the government. And getting the balance right has always been a challenge in every single so-called democracy. And when we can compare side by side, it looks like, for instance, appointed regulators are a little bit more laissez-faire and a little bit more efficiency-seeking than elected regulators. Central banks that are kept far from the elected politicians seem to do a better job focusing on low, stable inflation than other central banks, and the economic growth they get is just as good.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting. There's definitely a lot at play here, no question about it. But
absolutely.
That's fascinating. Let's switch gears and talk about hive mind. But of course, if you want to bring it back to this, feel free. So the hive mind is a really interesting idea, and I don't know that this has been studied much, if at all. That the IQ scores, the aggregate IQ score of a nation, affects its next economic cycle, right? Tell us more about this.
Yes. So the idea is that I'm drawing on decades of research in psychology, and psychologists have found that intelligence scores or maths and science scores, however you care to think of them, are quite good predictors of individual life outcomes. When I and my psychologist co-author took cross-country IQ scores and used those to try to predict national economic performance, we found the relationship was perhaps 6 times stronger across countries compared to within a country. So it really did look like being in a smart group of people was much more important for your prosperity than being smart yourself. So It's a version of the would you rather be a small fish in a big pond, right, or vice versa. So it looks like intelligence, cognitive skills have really big positive spillovers. So being on a smart team really helps make you more productive.
Yeah, that's interesting. When you look at economics, though, I mean, economics is, as much as we like to say, well, the pie there's enough for everybody to go around, right? It is, and that's true. Capitalism does expand the size of the pie, and that's one of the wonderful things about it, because new innovations and creative destruction expand, it makes the pie bigger. And I think we'd all agree with that. That's wonderful. But,
great.
In the short term, though, it is a competitive and relative game, too. So now also, I mean, the smartest people aren't always the richest people, and the richest people aren't always the smartest people. There's certainly some degree of luck and, I don't know, just seizing an opportunity when it comes. And
a lot of success in life isn't smarts. So,
sorry, say that again?
A lot of success in life isn't smarts. It's what my dad called stick-to-itiveness.
Yeah, right. Persistence pays. Yeah. No question about it. So, but in the short term, it is a relative game where actors inside an economy are competitive, right? Because when one person succeeds more than another, for example, if the whole economy is stagnant, but one person is, getting way ahead, the prices in the marketplace don't really adjust. And that one person getting ahead, their lifestyle expands a lot because there hasn't really been inflation because the overall economy is stagnant. You get the advantage of, your increased buying power without seeing increased prices, right?
So this is a point that I begin with at the very beginning of the book, and it shows up in the introduction even, that it looks like when you have pairs and groups of smarter people, they're more likely to be growing the pie. I totally agree with you that smarter individuals on average tend to do better for themselves as individuals. And so if the pie's fixed, yes, smarter people are probably shrewder, more Machiavellian about grabbing a big slice for themselves. But when you have a whole nation of smart people, for instance, my colleague Brian Kaplan in his book, Myth of the Rational Voter, and in later work, he's shown that people who are more educated or more intelligent are more likely to see the invisible hand. They're more likely to support laissez-faire, both individually and politically. And so, we know that capitalism, however we consider it, moving more in the direction of markets and individual choice for market transactions is a pie growing choice. And how can I get that? One way to do that is to have smarter voters around me. Mm-hmm. Probably one way to do that is have more market-friendly education in K through 12 and in college as well.
Well, I would agree with you there for sure. Absolutely. And there's a terrible shortage of that out there. So are you saying that on the whole, then, libertarians are smarter than liberals?
I've never seen that formally tested. I can tell you that good work suggests that people who do better on IQ tests are both more market-friendly and more socially tolerant. So in the general cliche version of libertarianism, yes, higher IQ people on average seem to be more libertarian, or as we would have said in the 19th century, more liberal.
Mm-hmm. You're making me think of, the definition of liberal has definitely changed over the years. No question about that. So that's a good point. But you're making me think of, these third world countries, and I've visited many of them myself. Political correct people, developing countries. And, you see there's, it's a banana republic type of concept, right? Where you've got, a few rich people and then everybody else is, oppressed, sadly. And those don't look like good places to live, even if you are the rich one, because, you've got like bodyguards and barbed wire. And I don't want to live like that. I'd rather just be a middle-class guy in a safer country like the U.S. But,
oligarchs in low productivity countries do not have a life that I envy, and I don't think most of us who are middle class or above in the rich countries would envy it.
Yeah, I would agree with you completely.
If they could find a way to credibly make their countries more market friendly, more productive, they themselves would be better off on average. But the problem is, there are a lot of reasons why that doesn't happen. You have to imagine the most extreme version of this is North Korea, right? Where the only way to make things better off for 99% of North Koreans is to make things very bad for the Kim family. And so that desire of the elites to stay on top really can hold down the masses.
It just seems like if the Kim family were like, nice people, which I don't think they are, they could just gradually loosen up and open up. But what'll likely happen is what happened to Ceausescu. Eventually they'll just be overthrown and executed.
This is the lesson of many reformers who are autocrats who decide to open up and become more market-oriented and more free, is that, to some degree at least, Milton Friedman's prophecy was right, which is that capitalism leads to democracy. And once a country starts getting richer, there's this tendency that the Chinese elites have managed to suppress so far, but there's this tendency for more openness in the society, and it's hard to resist that.
Yeah, China's a funny thing. It's almost hard to classify China with the way they act. It's kind of very capitalistic on one hand and very totalitarian on another. Feel free to comment on that. But
it's hard to tell whether that's going to be a equilibrium that other countries want to follow over the next few decades. Yeah. So the cliche and in some development circles has been that for decades has been that Russia put the liberal rights before the prosperity, and that was bad for the elites in Russia, and they've certainly never forgotten that. So China did not make that. They got the order in reverse. They decided we're going to go with prosperity first and see where that goes. Mm-hmm. So they basically are trying to get the capitalism without the democracy, the capitalism without the liberal human rights.
And which plan's better, by the way, Russia or China? That's a good comparison.
This is a great question. If you had to just pick one for the world as a whole, this is terrible, right? Because if you're thinking from the world as a whole, you have to wonder about, what you really should wonder about is who is creating great ideas, great concepts, great inventions for the whole planet. China has been a leader in patenting for the last decade plus, probably 2 decades. I haven't looked back that far.
That's
a gift for the world. They're doing some kind of scientific innovation that helps all of us.
Sure.
A lot of the manufactured goods that are very high tech are coming out of China, not out of Russia.
Yeah.
So if I just think crudely about the self-interest of the rest of the world, that they have to be people outside of those two countries should probably be rooting for the Chinese model.
Yeah, I would agree. I'd like to ask you about a couple of your chapter heads in the Hive book. So you talk about the Da Vinci Effect for nations. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes. So, Leonardo da Vinci was basically great at everything. And his expertise in one area was bundled together with expertise in other areas. And this turns out to be what's true with across human cognitive traits. The most robust finding in all of intelligence research is that if you're above average in one area, you're going to be above average in other areas too. So skills predict skills. So the common sense idea that we maybe heard from our parents or grandparents that if you're strong in one area, that just means you're weak in another and nature is fair and it all balances out. Total nonsense. Mm-hmm. Not true at all. And so this is why it's false when people say that IQ tests only tell whether you're good at IQ tests. It turns out that if I know how well you do on a vocabulary test, if I know you're way above average on a vocabulary test, I can guess that you're probably above average at math too. Doesn't mean you're an expert at math, just means you're probably above average. Right. And so a lot of the expertise we need in entrepreneurship or as voters or in our personal lives are something like this Da Vinci Effect, where you kind of want a little bit of everything. And getting a little bit of everything, a little bit of all the skills together can lead to a whole that's much greater than the sum of the parts.
So then you would be in favor of being a generalist, it sounds like.
Well, the thing is that we're already generalists, right? People who are above average on whatever test score you're looking at tend to have a little bit of everything going right. Of course, it's important to have experts in surgery or electrical engineering or thermonuclear physics. But it turns out that as a fact, there's this common experience that we have as humans, which is people good in one area tend to be above average in other areas.
Yeah, good stuff. I think that might be a sign that they're just more curious people and they have more tools with which to think.
This is actually one possibility that theorists have kicked around. It's very hard to test, but it seems totally possible. Some IQ theorists who think that there's sort of one common force inside of you, that they call it a G factor, that kind of makes all of these traits move together. And other theorists say, well, if you're good in one area, that kind of just gives you a leg up at studying other stuff. Mm-hmm. So if you're great at math, you're probably good at memorizing things, and that's going to help you in other areas.
Right. Yeah, I could see that. I also think it's just a question of having a large enough vocabulary to have tools with which to think, I think that helps expand your thinking skills, really. You talk about how smarter groups are more cooperative, and you alluded to that before. Can you elaborate on that, though?
Yeah, this is something that's actually my favorite discovery. I can't claim to have uniquely been the only person who discovered it. I sort of found that other people had run laboratory experiments, these cooperation games. The most famous one is the Prisoner's Dilemma. Mm-hmm. But it's a game somebody plays for 10. Two people play against each other for 10 rounds, and there's always a short-run incentive to betray the other person. But if you cooperate, you can grow something beautiful. So think of this as being like a team project that two people are working on for school, and they have to get it done in a month. If I cooperate today and you decide to cooperate today, maybe we just follow that pattern on out. But if we try to shirk, the other person might decide to shirk, sleep in, and then nothing happens. It turns out that smarter pairs of players, higher IQ pairs of players, are more likely to be highly cooperative in that particular game. Mm-hmm. I worked on some research with some of my GMU colleagues on this, and it turns out that it's been replicated in research by a professor at the University of Minnesota.
And by the way, for those who don't know, the Prisoner's Dilemma, you can look it up, but it's basically this game where two people are being prosecuted for a crime. I don't know if they're being prosecuted, but they're being given a choice to, get out of jail if they rat out their friend, or they could cooperate together and they'll both get less time, right? I didn't explain it too well, but that's the concept. And, I think a lot of that just sort of goes back to the concept of long-term thinking, doesn't it?
Exactly. And this is something that I and others have placed weight on. Yes, this idea that higher IQ people tend to be more patient, and patience has many, many virtues.
I think that's a huge thing. The willingness to delay gratification is a sign of intelligence. I think that that's true, and I very much believe it, but I wonder why it's true. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, I point to some research by some Yale scholars on this. And they're just speculating, but what they suspect is that part of the reason smarter people are more patient is that making a decision about the future, whether to eat your potatoes today or eat it next week, is a decision that involves thinking of keeping 4 ideas in mind at once. The world with the potato now, the world without the potato now, the world with the potato in the future and without the potato in the future. And that's a lot of comparing to do. And It turns out one of the best predictors of a high IQ is how many facts you can keep in your mind at once.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I don't think that's the only story, but I think it's certainly part of it, that basically patience requires comparisons. And comparisons means keeping multiple ideas in your head, doing basically juggling with ideas.
Right. And many times those ideas are opposing. I'd rather have the reward today, but if I wait longer, I'm going to get a bigger reward. So very, very good point. Anything you'd like to share with our listeners, a question that I didn't ask you about either of the 2 books or your work in general?
Yeah, in 10% Less Democracy, in the wake of the coronavirus and the way the world's been changed, people have asked me, well, the World Health Organization's messed up. The Food and Drug Administration has made a lot of errors. The Centers for Disease Control has made a lot of mistakes. Isn't that disproving your case right there? And it turns out, as you won't be surprised to learn, that the World Health Organization is not at all an independent agency. It has to get annual budgets from the U.S., from a bunch of other rich countries, and it answers to those folks. The leaders have short terms. The head of the FDA and the Centers for Disease Control both work at the pleasure of the president and have to go to Congress for money every year. Mm-hmm. And the Congress is especially cautious and conservative about innovation at the Centers for Disease Control and at Food and Drug Administration. They've been real barriers to innovation over the long term, as some of my GMU colleagues have shown in their work. So it's no surprise to me that these agencies, which are not very independent at all, have made a lot of massive mistakes during the crisis, and that perhaps the best performing U.S. government agency has been the Federal Reserve, which has been super aggressive from the day one and seems to have prevented a lot of bad financial consequences that people were predicting early on.
When you talk about the central bank or, the banks in general or the Federal Reserve specifically, what do you say to all the people who think that they're, stealing our money through inflation, our savings, our wealth? It's this, private corporation that's got all this mystery behind it. Ron Paul wanted it audited, that went over like a lead balloon. I don't know, in the short term, I agree. The central bank steps in and, here comes the cavalry. But in the long run, the dollar loses a lot of its value over time.
Well, the Fed is totally owned and controlled by the U.S. government. It can shut it down at any time. It can take all their money at any time. And so it is a creature of our federal government, not a private company. And it does seem as though this...
That, just so you know.
I know, I understand. But over the long haul, it's clear that countries with independent central banks that are kept far from the voters do tend to have lower inflation and no worse economic growth. So if independent central banks, if secretive Federal Reserve officials were actually bad for the country, we'd be able to do some kind of comparison and show that other countries that picked a better policy had much better outcomes. And there doesn't seem in the last, at least since World War II, to be some other country that found an alternative method of national banking that's been a vast outperformer. It might be a tie. I think the U.S. economic growth before the Fed was no worse. Its inflation, I would say, was more volatile than we've had since then. Mm-hmm. But at least since World War II, the central banks that are kept far from voters and that are where basically technocrats run things day in and day out seem to get the best performance we've seen. I'm always open to innovation. I'm always open to somebody saying, hey, I've got something we knew we can try. But so far, it's the best thing we've got going.
Yeah. Good stuff. Okay, well, give out your website and just wrap this up with any closing thought.
Yes. My website is jonesgarett.com. 1 R, 2 T's, jonesgarett.com. And I'm very happy to talk in the future with you about my next project, which is going to be about how immigrants bring cultural traits to the countries they move to.
Excellent. Interesting. Good stuff. Well, Dr. Garett Jones, thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any episodes. Be sure to check out the show's specific website and our general website, hartmanmedia.com, for appropriate disclaimers and terms of service. Remember that guest opinions are their own, and if you require specific legal or tax advice or advice in any other specialized area, please consult an appropriate professional. And we also very much appreciate you reviewing the show. Please go to iTunes or Stitcher Radio or whatever platform you're using and write a review for the show. We would very much appreciate that. And be sure to make it official and subscribe so you do not miss any episodes. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode.